Hi everyone, I'm Lin and welcome back to Language Corner with Lin. Today we're starting a new science series and I want to begin with a question that almost everyone has asked at some point. Why are teenagers so different? Why do they seem so emotional? Why do they sometimes make risky decisions that adults simply don't understand? For a very long time, people blamed hormones for almost everything teenagers do. Hormones certainly play a role, but they're only part of the story. The real answer is much more interesting. It has to do with what's happening inside the brain. Now, if you're a teenager, I have some good news for you. You're not broken, you're not crazy, and you're definitely not doing everything wrong. Your brain is simply going through one of the biggest changes it will ever experience. Today, let's take a look at what scientists have discovered about the teenage brain. By the end of this podcast, you'll understand why teenagers think, feel, and behave differently, not because they're immature, but because their brains are still developing. So, let's get cracking. Let's start with one of the biggest myths about the teenage brain. Some people think that teenagers simply have unfinished brains. That's not quite true. A better way to think about it is this. Imagine your brain is like a city. When you're a child, your brain builds roads everywhere. Some roads are used for language, some are used for music, some help you ride a bike, some help you recognize faces, and many more are built just in case you might need them one day. Your brain creates a millions of connections because children are constantly learning new things. But keeping every single connection forever isn't very efficient. So during adolescence, your brain begins a huge renovation project. Some connections become stronger because you use them every day. Others slowly disappear because your brain realizes they are no longer needed. This process is sometimes described as a rewiring the brain. Think of it like upgrading the electrical wiring in your house. You're not making the house smaller, you're making it work better. That's why I love the sentence. Your brain isn't shrinking, it's becoming smarter. The goal isn't to have more connections, the goal is to have better ones. Now, here's where things get really interesting. Earlier, we talked about how the brain removes some neural connections and strengthens others. But how does it decide which ones to keep? Well, imagine you have a beautiful tree in your garden. Every year, it grows lots of new branches. Some branches become strong and healthy. Others stay weak or never really grow. If you leave every single branch on the tree, it eventually becomes crowded. The healthy branches don't get enough sunlight, enough space, or enough nutrients. So, what do the gardeners do? They prune the tree. They carefully cut away the weak branches so the healthy ones can grow even stronger. Your brain does something very similar. Instead of branches, it has a billions of connections between brain cells. Every time you practice a skill, read a book, learn a language, or play an instrument, you're telling your brain, hey, this connection is important. Keep it. But the connections you rarely use gradually become weaker and may eventually disappear. Scientists call this process synaptic pruning. It might sound a little scary, but it's actually a very healthy and completely natural process. Your brain isn't throwing away useful information, it's making itself faster, stronger, and more efficient. Think of it this way: a computer with thousands of unnecessary files often becomes slower over time. After cleaning those files, it usually runs much better. Your brain is doing something similar. It's not trying to become bigger, it's trying to become better. Now, let's answer one of the biggest questions about teenagers. Why do they seem to take more risks? Maybe you've seen a teenager riding a skateboard down a steep hill, trying a dangerous challenge, or doing something silly simply because their friends are watching. From an adult's perspective, you might think, why would anyone do that? Well, the answer isn't as simple as they're irresponsible. In fact, teenagers often do know that something is risky. The difference is how their brains respond to rewards. Inside your brain is a network called the reward system. Whenever you experience something exciting, enjoyable, or new, this system becomes active. It releases chemicals that make those experiences feel rewarding and motivating. During adolescence, this reward system develops quite early. So teenagers naturally become more curious. They're more willing to explore. They're more interested in trying something they've never done before. But here's the interesting part: the part of the brain responsible for planning ahead, controlling impulses, and thinking about long term consequences, the prefrontal cortex, is still developing. So, for a period of time, these two systems are developing at different speeds. One says, that looks exciting, let's do it. The other says, maybe we should think about this first. But that second voice isn't fully mature yet. A good way to imagine this is to think about driving a car. Imagine a car with a very powerful engine, but brakes that are still being upgraded. The engine isn't broken. The brakes aren't broken either. They just haven't caught up yet. The teenage brain works in a similar way. That's why scientists say teenagers aren't less intelligent. Their brains are simply developing on a different timeline. And understanding that difference helps explain many teenage behaviors, not just risk taking, but also curiosity, creativity, and a willingness to explore the world. Have you ever seen a teenager become incredibly happy after receiving a compliment, or extremely upset because of a small disagreement? To adults, the reaction can sometimes seem a little dramatic. But here's the interesting part. For many teenagers, those emotions genuinely feel much stronger. So, what's happening? One important reason is a part of the brain called the limbic system. The limbic system plays a major role in processing emotions like happiness, fear, excitement, and sadness. During adolescence, their system becomes highly active. That means emotional experiences can feel much more intense than they do for most adults. Think about receiving a compliment. If you're an adult, you might smile and think, that was nice. But for a teenager, that same compliment can feel incredibly exciting and meaningful. Now, think about criticism. A small negative comment that an adult might quickly forget could stay in a teenager's mind for hours or even days. The same is true for first friendships, first heartbreaks, or first achievements. These experiences often leave a much stronger emotional impression because the brain is especially sensitive during this stage of life. Of course, this doesn't mean every teenager reacts in exactly the same way. Everyone is different. But understanding how the brain develops helps explain why emotions often feel bigger during adolescence. So, the next time you see a teenager laughing louder, crying harder, or feeling deeply about something, remember their brain isn't overreacting on purpose. It's simply experiencing the world differently. Now, let's talk about something that becomes incredibly important during the teenage years friends. Have you ever noticed that teenagers often spend more time with their friends than with their families? That's completely normal. As children grow into teenagers, they're also learning an important life skill, becoming independent. And during that journey, friendships begin to play a much bigger role. One reason is something psychologists call belonging. As humans, we all want to feel that we're part of a group. But during adolescence, that need becomes especially strong. Teenagers don't just want friends, they want to feel accepted, they want to feel included, they want to know that they belong somewhere. That's why the opinions of friends often matter so much. A simple compliment from a close friend can brighten an entire day. On the other hand, feeling left out of a group chat or not being invited to an event can feel surprisingly painful. And here's something important. People often talk about peer pressure as if it's always a bad thing, but that's not entirely true. Friends can certainly influence risky behavior, but they can also influence positive behavior. For example, if your friends enjoy reading, exercising, or studying hard, you're more likely to develop those habits too. In other words, teenagers don't just learn from parents or teachers, they also learn from the people they spend the most time with. So, friendships during adolescence aren't just about having fun. They're helping shape a person's confidence, habits, and even their identity. So far, we've talked about how the teenage brain is changing. We've seen how neural connections are reorganized, why teenagers may take more risks, and why emotions and friendships become so important. But there's one more reason why understanding the teenage brain really matters: mental health. Adolescence isn't just a period of physical growth, it's also one of the most important stages of brain development. During these years, the brain is changing rapidly, and because of that, this is also the time when many mental health conditions first begin to appear. Now, it's important to understand what this does not mean. It doesn't mean that every teenager will experience a mental health disorder. Most teenagers grow up healthy and do just fine. But it does mean that this stage of life is especially important. The earlier we recognize when someone is struggling, the sooner they can receive the support they need. Sometimes adults dismiss teenage emotions by saying, "Oh, it's just a phase." Sometimes it is, but sometimes those feelings may be a sign that a young person needs help. That's why listening, understanding, and offering support can make a huge difference. The goal isn't to label teenagers, the goal is to understand them. Because when we understand how the brain develops, we become more patient, more supportive, and better able to help. And perhaps that's one of the most important lessons neuroscience can teach us. And here are three fascinating facts about the teenage brain. The first one might surprise you. Your brain reaches almost its full physical size between the ages of 11 and 14. So by the time you're a teenager, your brain is already almost as big as an adult's brain. But here's the interesting part. Size doesn't mean maturity. Think about buying a brand new computer. The hardware might already be there, but you still need to install software, organize files, and optimize the system before it works at its best. The brain is similar. It's not getting much bigger, it's getting better organized. Now for the second fact. The part of the brain responsible for planning, decision making, and self control, the prefrontal cortex, continues developing well into your 20s. That's much later than many people expect. So, brain development doesn't suddenly stop when you turn 18. It continues for several more years. And finally, here's my favorite fact. After infancy, adolescence is the most active period of the brain rewiring in your entire life. Think about that for a moment. Your teenage years aren't just a time of change on the outside. They're one of the biggest periods of change happening inside your brain. That's why the habits you build, the skills you practice, and the experience you have during these years can have such a lasting impact. In other words, your teenage brain isn't just growing, it's building the person you will become in the future. Before we finish, let's go back to the question we asked at the very beginning. Why are teenagers so different? Well, now we know the answer. It's not because they're less intelligent. It's not because they don't care. And it's certainly not because they're broken. Their brain are simply going through one of the most important stages of development. They're learning, growing, making mistakes, and slowly building the skills they'll use for the rest of their lives. Understanding this doesn't mean we should excuse every bad decision, but it does remind us to be a little more patient, a little more understanding, and a little more supportive. Because behind every emotional reaction, every risky decision, and every awkward teenage moment, there's a brain that's still learning how to become an adult. So, whether you're a teenager yourself, a parent, a teacher, or simply someone who's curious about how the brain works, I hope this video helped you understand adolescence a little better. If you enjoyed today's podcast, don't forget to like and subscribe. And if there's another science topic you'd like me to explain, let me know in the comments. Thanks for watching. I'll see you in the next one.